Alrighty, I guess it's 9 o'clock. Welcome everybody on the last day of the conference. So how many people's brains are full? Anyone? Okay, I got a few. I certainly know that feeling. I hope you've been enjoying your experience, and I hope you had some fun at the parties last night. My name is Chris Tavares. I'm a program manager on the browser programmability and tools team, and we are one of the many teams that have been contributing to the Win.js libraries and the Windows 8 developer experience. So I just want to start with a clarification. I believe the title in the program for this talk was Building Metro-Style Apps in JavaScript or something along those lines. That's not actually the talk I prepared. This is what I prepared, building real-world Metro-Style apps using JavaScript. The difference is that one of the things our team has been doing a lot of is application building. And as part of that, we've seen various patterns come out and how techniques to deal with external libraries and issues that are unique to the Metro-style app environment, which are important to know about. So this is kind of the agenda we're going to talk about. First one is some of the common JavaScript patterns and helpers we have in the Win.js library to implement them. Third-party JavaScript libraries. What, you mean you don't only want to use Win.js ever and forever? And then some particularly areas of security in the app container sandbox, which will impact not just your applications, but also are a little different than third-party libraries are used to running in, so things may get tweaked a little bit. So just a couple of administrivia things. Since it is very early in the morning, I would prefer to this be a little bit more casual. So if you have questions, feel free to raise them during the talk. I will be happy to answer them. We only ask for the sake of the recording, if you could please go to one of the microphones to ask your question so that you will get on the recording and everybody can hear the question as well. So the second thing I wanted to ask, how many people in the room here would consider themselves reasonably experienced JavaScript developers? Okay, looks like a good chunk of the room. All right. As a result, I'm going to take some of this stuff fairly quickly, since you guys are probably already familiar with a lot of what I'm about to say. And for those of you who are not fairly experienced JavaScript developers, I will have some references at the back for you to come up to speed on this. All right, let's get started. So scope in JavaScript is kind of interesting, particularly to those of us coming from a more computer sciencey background. Most languages these days have what's called block scope. Classic C or C++ or C#. You got a curly brace that defines a scope. You put a variable inside that curly brace. That variable is not visible outside that block. JavaScript does not have block scope. JavaScript has global scope, and it has function scope. And the other thing is that JavaScript tries really, really, really hard to get you to make all of your variables global. The default, if you forget that nice little var keyword, is global. This becomes a problem in larger applications because, of course, the more global variables you have, the harder it is to debug, the harder it is to figure out where this value got set, that sort of thing. In typical web pages, this is actually not that much of a problem because the amount of script you're running on a page is fairly small. And when you hit a link, you go to another page, at which point the browser dumps everything it had in memory and starts up a whole new script context. In Metro-style apps, you typically are not navigating your browser. You're staying on a single page and manipulating the DOM programmatically. This means, of course, that you have no problems with managing scope. You don't have to shovel stuff up to a server and back or serializing stuff onto a query string. But it does mean you have to care a lot more about global scope and keeping your variables local just to keep yourself sane. Now, I'm going to talk specifically about JavaScript. Something to also note is that CSS, if you've got CSS styles and selectors and whatnot, that's just one big global bucket. We do not have a good answer for that since CSS is not a programming language. So our answer for that is really, if you're dividing your app up into separate pages, prefix the styles that are specific to that page with a common front end, so that you can at least make sure you're not colliding across the pages in your app. So, with variable scopes, okay, just be aware, you're going to have some globals. Every app does. Do it deliberately. Don't forget the var keyword. And there are a couple of patterns in JavaScript modules and namespaces that help alleviate this problem significantly. So here's the module pattern. Basically, we've got some code with global scope. That a variable is global, some private stuff, that's global, but does it need to be global? No. We specifically say we want a private. So do this. You experienced JavaScript folks will probably see this right off. This is simply defining an anonymous function and then executing it immediately. Remember, JavaScript has function scope, so by doing this, all these variables are immediately pulled into that function scope and are not leaked out into the global scope. And of course, you can still access the global scope from within that function, like I'm doing here. I'm calling out to WinJS navigation, which is a global function. The other useful tool is the idea of namespaces. JavaScript, of course, does not have the concept of namespaces in the language itself. However, JavaScript objects are an incredibly malleable and useful beast, and you can use objects to simulate namespaces. So here we have a my namespace object. I want to be able to call my namespace something useful. Where's my mouse cursor? There we go. So to define that, you can tack my namespace onto the global scope. Window dot is the JavaScript name for globals. Boy, that's obvious. And then we can say window my namespace something useful. I have to do this little dance here because somebody else may have already created the my namespace object. I don't want to just wipe it out and remove all their definitions. I want to add to it. So this is the JavaScript syntax for saying, if window.mynamespace is defined, use it. Otherwise, start with an empty object and assign that. Now, the namespace pattern is something you're going to use all over the place. This works. You have to admit it's somewhat tedious, especially as we get nested namespaces. And every dot you type is an opportunity to type the thing between the dots incorrectly. So it would be nice if we could make this a little less noisy. So we have helpers in the base.js file for implementing the namespace pattern. Okay, it's WinJS namespace define. There's also WinJS namespace with parent. I don't have an example of that, but I'll explain what that does in a moment. So our previous example simply becomes this. WinJS namespace define is essentially executing exactly the code that we saw in the previous slide, except that it is much shorter, fewer opportunities to type things wrong. By the way, the string you pass to that namespace define as that first parameter, the name of your namespace, can have dots in it. So I could say my namespace dot version1 dot utilities, for example, and it will build that object graph recursively. Now the only difference between define and with parent is with parent takes an additional parameter, which is the namespace object to start from. With define, you start from the root. Okay, any questions on that? No? Pretty straightforward stuff. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Is the microphone on?
I don't know, is the microphone on?
Well, I'll just go ahead and ask.
Okay.
In the previous example, you had shown you had code in case the namespace already existed. Does this definition handle that?
Yes, it does. WinJS namespace define treats the namespaces as open, as in every time you call JS namespace define with the same name, it will in fact add to whatever was already in that namespace. So this is an additive process, and it does make it easier if you want to split your code up into multiple files for ease of development, but you want them to look like they're all in the same namespace from an API standpoint. All right. Now, namespaces and modules combine in an interesting way in that, I have here a module. I have my something private, which is a private implementation method. Something useful is something I want to export to the outside world. So this is a pattern you're going to see a lot in the WinJS code itself and in the code that is generated by your Visual Studio templates, what I call the module export. It's really pretty simple. You have your module file level, you've got all your local stuff, and then at the bottom somewhere, you call win.js namespace define, and then you export some of the private stuff out to the global scope through a namespace in order that it is accessible to the outside world. So the net result of running this code is that in the my namespace, you will have the something useful method. In my namespace, you will have the something useful method, and that's it. The something private remains completely private. Now, since they are in the same module, something useful can, in fact, call something private. So it's a way to manage public visibility. All right. Another tweak you will see, remember, a module is just a function, right? Functions can have parameters, right? So you will see some module definitions that actually use the parameter list. This is also a fairly common pattern in our code base. There's two reasons to do this. One of them, I find it is a little bit clearer because the parameters you pass to the function effectively become globals within that module. The other piece is there's actually a performance gain there. The reason being, we have nested scopes because, I said we don't have block scope, we do have function scope. We do have functions within functions within functions, right? So when JavaScript is looking up a variable, because really, when you say when you say console.log x plus 1, where does x come from? Well, the JavaScript interpreter is going to go looking in its local variables. Is there a variable named x? No. Well, I'm going to look in the function that contains me. Do you have a variable named x? No, I'm going to look in the function that contains me. Do you have a variable at x? Oh, no, I'm going to look in the globals. Is there a variable named x? So hitting the globals typically is going to involve at least one, possibly two or three hops up that chain. By putting it in as a function parameter in the module, that variable then you then get to cut off some of those steps. So the way this looks is like so. We have our function module, our module here. So A is global. Module, I'm passing two parameters, global and win.js. Isn't it win.js a namespace? Well, remember, namespaces are just JavaScript objects. You can pass them around like any other object. Here, I then go ahead and use that. For example, here. And at the bottom, where I've got my invocation, I'm just passing the parameters, which then get put up here. I also happen to rename this because I think window as globals feels a little weird. So I renamed it as global at the top there. This line here is an alternative. It's accomplishing the same thing performance-wise. So you will also see this as well. It's an alias. Basically, I'm defining that variable q. That's equal to that win.js utilities query function. Couple reasons for that. One of them, q is a lot shorter to type than win.js.utilities.query. And the other is by going to q, again, I'm getting a local module level variable, so I don't have as many lookups to go up, because this would actually have to go inside that win.js UI process all call, where I'm calling q. If I'd said win.js utilities query, well, it would have to look for win.js here. Wouldn't find it. It would go out to the module, look for it there, look for win.js out in the global scope, and then it'll have to drill down into it for utilities query. So here I've just grabbed the whole thing all at once. I put both on this slide because you will see both of these in our sample code. All right. Defining objects. Let's just go to this code demo. There have been some styles of JavaScript over the last few years that recommended when you're creating an object constructor, you should define your member variables or your member functions locally inside the constructor and assign them there rather than using the prototype. Do not do that. Use the prototype instead. Okay. The reasons for the major reason for this is major performance and memory issues. The By having this private function inside the constructor, every time you invoke the constructor, that function object is recreated, which means that none of your objects are sharing any implementation. In addition, in Metro-style apps, the JavaScript interpreter, Chakra, actually has special code that optimizes looking for methods in the prototype. And if you've tacked them on manually in the constructor, you will end up defeating that optimization. You can take a potentially serious performance hit on that. So it's fairly straightforward. Defining prototypes is a very common thing to do. So we have some helpers on the WinJS class namespace. Just want to say, for those who are familiar with the old Ajax control toolkit, just because we say WinJS.class does not mean we're trying to put a whole new class-based object model on top of JavaScript. That is not the goal. We just couldn't think of a better word to describe what this was doing than class. So what this is doing is defining an object constructor and prototype. So here's the equivalent code to what we had in the previous slide. But instead of saying mything.prototype.method1 equals, we call WinJS class.define, pass a constructor function, which can take any parameters you want, whatever. And then it takes an object as a second parameter, and every member of that object will be placed on the prototype of this constructor. And then the constructor is returned. Okay. One other option, people used to static languages coming from C++ or C# world to go looking for inheritance hierarchies. The closest thing that JavaScript has is the idea of the prototype chain. So you have a JavaScript object, it goes looking for a method, it'll look in the prototype. If it's not in that prototype, it'll look at its prototype, and so on up the chain. In general, you're typically not going to want to do this, because chasing up those prototypes can be expensive. And it is also the issue that you may end up with methods you never knew, you don't even know where they came from. So instead, put the methods you want directly on the prototype in most cases. This is what's known as a mix-in. Right. JavaScript is very malleable. Take advantage of that malleability. You can pull methods off of one object, stick it on another pretty easily, and it will all just work. And so we have another helper, we already talked about that, for doing mix-ins called WinJS class.mix. So let's just show an example. I love this example. This is actual code. Well, my control is not in our code base, but these are using mix-ins we have in our code. So kind of the canonical example for mix-ins is event handling. I've got an object. I'm building, in this case, a custom control. I want to fire custom events from this control. I want to fire it up through the DOM tree. I want to support add event listener. I want to support I got to support registrations for events. It's a bunch of code. It's not hard, but it's boilerplate. It's repetitive. So what we've done is we've created this WinJS UI DOM event mix-in. This guy contains all the code for add event listener. It contains the code for tracking who has registered for callbacks, and it has the code for firing events into the DOM. So here I have my WinJS class mix. Here's the constructor function for my control. And by the way, you could call, the way we usually do this is we'd have a WinJS class define first. We'd get the constructor from that, then pass it to WinJS class.mix. Then we're mixing in two things, UI DOM event mix-in. What this is going to do is going to look at the DOM event mix-in object and say, oh, okay, here's all your public methods. It's going to borrow those, stick them on my prototype too. We also have WinJS utilities create event properties. This is a little utility function. What this is doing is I need, you want not just add event listener, you really want the on event name properties as well, just for convenience sake. So what create event properties does is it actually creates an object. It takes the names here. So I want an event called swizzle, an event called spin, and it will create an object that has properties set up for on swizzle and on spin. that turn around and call add event listener when you set them. So the net result is to get event handling, this is basically all I need to do in my class. Everything else is taken care of for me by the mix-in, and now I can simply call, c.onSwizzle equals something, or add event listener spin, and then as those events occur, they will just happen. So it's a nice pattern for code reuse that is not available in most static languages. All right, so that is where, that's what, as much as I'm going to say on the JavaScript patterns. I'm happy to talk at length more if you're interested, or if you if you're not familiar with JavaScript and you need a little recap. So here's, I think, the burning question for every JavaScript developer that has come to this conference that has not explicitly talked to me. This is a list of JavaScript libraries out there that are popular that I came up in about 15 seconds. There are a lot of them out there. There are a lot of people who use them. We want you to keep using them. So here I'm going to state unequivocally and for the record, can I use jQuery in a Metro-style app? Yes. It just works. And to prove it, this is a sample application. This is a different code than the stocks app that's actually on your image, but you can get this from the VS sample gallery. Okay, so we can, it gets a list of stocks. This is actually going out to the one of the Microsoft APIs for pulling stock data. I select a different one. We get various news, etc. So small, but still fairly full-featured. If I go back to Visual Studio, actually, let me just stop that. Zoom in. This app is using jQuery. We didn't have to do anything special to get it to work. We just bring it in, use it. That plot is actually used. Pardon me, is actually built using the JQplot plugin. So let's actually, and they all play fairly nicely together. So find the code I'm looking for. Actually, JQplot. Okay, yeah, we don't actually want to look in the JQplot source, do we? HTML, there we go. So here, classic jQuery. You go ahead and use it however you want. We're using the JQplot plugin. We're putting the plot up on the screen. Sorry, this is not more climactic, but actually that should be the climax of this discussion. I didn't have to do anything special. It just works. Cool. So, shift. And I'm going to be using jQuery specifically for my example, simply because that is the library I'm most familiar with. But what I'm about to talk about may affect other libraries as well. All right, so of course there is the except. So there's three major differences. The first one has to do with, is specific to the latest versions of jQuery, although I suspect it will pop up with some other libraries as well. And then there's a couple host enforcement, local and web contexts are security features that are a little bit different than the standard browser. So in jQuery 1.6, if you're using the $AJAX method to do XML HTTP request, not that anybody ever does that, right? Yeah. They added a specific check to see if the browser supports cross-domain script requests, because there are newer environments which change the standard policy of you can only go back to the domain you came from. This is a feature called CORS, C-O-R-S. And no, I do not know what it stands for. IE10 does not support this feature, does not support CORS. However, inside a Metro-style app, the single domain requirement is not enforced. You can go to what you can do an XHR request to whatever URL you want. However, jQuery goes out and asks the browser, "Hey, call CORS and tell me if you do cross-domain cross-domain requests," and it's going to fail because the CORS part is not supported. It's also because the URL that the browser, when you ask you ask for body location or document window location. Anyway, when you ask for your location, it's not HTTP whack whack something. It's actually ms-www whack 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 something. That result being, if you've got existing jQuery code that's doing XML HTTP requests through $AJAX, those requests are going to fail in your existing code if you're using jQuery 1.6 or newer. There is, however, a couple of ways around it. One of them is, well, you could use our XML HTTP request wrapper instead, which doesn't do this check. Or, before you do the AJAX stuff in your startup code, add this line right here. $.support.cors equals true. Now, it's a little odd that setting a variable to true turns off something, but what this is actually doing is it's telling jQuery, yes, this browser supports cross-domain requests, just don't check for it, but it'll still work. So you need to add that line to your jQuery, basically add it to your app initialization code, and then $AJAX will start working again in a Metro-style app. And that link there, apijQuery.com/jQuery.support, will give you more details on what that code is actually doing. I will not be surprised to see other JavaScript libraries start to do this going forward as well. So hopefully they will have something similar. I cannot speak to whether IE or the Metro-style app host is going to support CORS. I just don't know. Okay. Now we get to probably the thing that will bite people the most. Okay, this is a security feature which is actually really, really useful and helpful. But of course, it's security, so you're never going to notice it until it actually starts getting in your way and you start pulling out your hair. This is something called host enforcement. This is a feature where it is very common to want to write mashup style apps. You know, I was building an RSS reader in my other talk. For example, you're going to want to be able to pull the HTML down and display it on your screen, right? Is HTML just markup? Is it just, divs and spans and whatnot? No. You can put script tag. You could be getting script tags in there. You could get advertising. You could get cross-site scripting attacks. You could get, well, you can't get pop-ups anymore. Pop-ups aren't allowed in Metro-style apps. But you could certainly imagine pulling down arbitrary chunks of HTML from the web, putting it in your screen, and accidentally getting something evil in there. So host enforcement, and this is worse in a WWA app, Metro-style app in JavaScript and HTML5. Because inside that, you have full access to the WinRT. So somebody posts or hacks somebody up some popular blog, for example, sneaks some script into the RSS feed, which could then load all the files in your local document and send it off to a server somewhere. Now, typically when building this sort of application, you're going to just grab the HTML, get it as a string, and set the inner HTML some element. That is when host enforcement kicks in, when you're going to be passing a string somewhere, and it has to get parsed automatically. So what host enforcement does is it will actually scan through that string as it's parsing, looking for bad stuff. There is, in fact, a whitelist. It's fairly large of elements that can go through. Okay? If you're not on that list, you will get an exception when you set a inner HTML. Or if you set outer HTML or you set adjacent HTML. This can be annoying because the HTML5 data dash attributes, except for a few specific exceptions, are not on that allowed list. I just want to point out, yeah, it sounds annoying. This is what you want. By default, you will be secure. You will not be subject to remote scripting attacks. You will not be subject to getting some data from the web and having it include bad code. You don't have to do anything in particular, just scrub it yourself. If somebody sends something bad to you, the system will protect the user of your application. However, we all know there are certain times, this just kicks in when you set inner HTML. How many of you setting inner HTML just to a string you've built up in your code and then never actually touches the web? Yeah, at least a few. Yeah. Question?
One of the techniques that we use on web pages right now is defer loading of JavaScripts until after the page renders. Mm-hmm. Is there, will that be blocked by this, or is there any benefit to doing that with Metro?
So this has nothing to do, you're talking when you put the deferred attribute on the script tag?
Sorry, no, using maybe some like a JS defer or, other people, I guess, might do like a Google load library type thing.
Okay, so
I think it was also present in the older
so I am not familiar with those techniques myself. HTML5 does explicitly have a defer attribute you can put on JavaScript on a script tag. But the basic answer, I suspect, is going to be yes, this may cause a problem there, because at the end it's going to have to load a script tag. Now, this actually brings up my next point. Sometimes you know what you're doing. Sometimes you're using it in a completely innocent way. So there is, in fact, ways to turn host enforcement off. If you know what you're doing. Big, bold, all caps, in italics. Okay? If you're turning host enforcement off, make sure you do a security review of the code so that you know that you're doing it correctly. Okay? So you can work around host enforcement. One thing you can do, this is great for the RSS reader scenario. There is a global toStatic HTML method. What this does, you pass it that string with potentially evil stuff in it, and it strips all the evil stuff out. So if you call toStatic HTML on that string before you call set inner HTML, or before you set inner HTML, then you will be safe. You will never get the exception. Second option, if you call the DOM creation APIs, the system assumes you know what you're doing. So if you call document create element and build it up, and element append child, those methods, it will assume you know what you're doing. Okay. There is also a set of methods on WinJS utilities defined in base.html. There's set inner HTML, set inner HTML unsafe, set outer HTML unsafe, etc. Okay. These, if you say set inner HTML unsafe, element comma string, it will then, that method will set the inner HTML in such a way that it will not trigger host enforcement. And then the final one, the grand escape hatch, is this method called msww-exec unsafe local function. It's, in my opinion, a little awkward to use in the simple cases, which is why we have the wrapper methods. So let's actually look at what this does. So actually, I'm going to go back to the stocks app here. Now, we have on the settings page here, actually, okay, we're going through, we're getting our stocks information, and notice we are building a div. It's got an on-click handler in it. And it's also got a data dash attribute in it. Being built up by string, perfectly reasonable. This is enough markup that would be kind of a pain in the neck to build it up by doing document create element div, blah, 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 blah. So, and I'm actually going to go ahead and pretend that code's not there. Let's run this guy. Oh. Is it currently running? It is not. Oh no. Mr. Projector, I think you're making my life 1280, 720, that's legal. Okay, let me try that again. Did we mention developer preview? It was running before you saw it. All right. Rather than debug try to figure this out right now, let's just talk through what's going to happen. So here, current settings.html. What does that call? What does that do? It sets the inner HTML property, right? With the code as it is, this will throw an exception at runtime because it's got that evil stuff in there. OnClick is considered evil because that code could be doing absolutely anything. Now, since we're going through jQuery here, we have to use the global escape hatch. mswwa.exec unsafe local function. What that does is you pass it a callback function. Let me scroll up a little bit. msexec unsafe local function will execute that callback in a context such that host enforcement is turned off. Now, I personally find this to be a little bit wordy for simple use, like setting a single value. Utilities dot set inner HTML unsafe. Although I guess we could do it this way. Okay, maybe that's not an HR. Yes, that name is a little bit long, set inner HTML unsafe. It's a little scary. It's intended to be. It's a reminder to you, hey, I'm doing something I need to review here. It's also very useful when you're going to do a review, you can just do a search for unsafe, and it will pop out very quickly. So why am I mentioning, this is a general feature of Metro-style apps in JavaScript. Why am I mentioning it now? Well, under the hood, your utility libraries may very well be setting inner HTML. Actually, one of the things that happened, I'm not supposed to talk about this, but it's a little glimpse inside the box. When host enforcement was first turned on in the builds, every jQuery app we had written in-house stopped working. Okay. The reason being, jQuery in its startup code, in order to do feature detection, actually does a bunch of element creation using inner HTML, and it's got that evil stuff in it. Okay. And so don't be surprised if you see this just calling something innocuous that you didn't realize might be setting inner HTML. And keep this in your back pocket. Now, just so you know, as part of that experience, we have massaged the implementation of host enforcement so that jQuery no longer triggers it. Although what happened was, because what jQuery was doing was creating a div, setting inner HTML, and doing some stuff, but was never actually attaching the div to the DOM. This is also a pattern that's useful, or may be useful to you later. Now here's the gotcha, is that, and why is it we could turn that off in that case? Well, that div is never actually attached to the DOM, so it's never live, so it's never actually dangerous, even if it has dangerous content in it. So what host enforcement actually does is if you create an element and set inner HTML, it doesn't actually do the check until that element is attached to the DOM. Which may mean you may get this exception in really weird spots. Because if you call some method which returns a DOM element which created something with inner HTML like 5 levels down in your code, you come back up, you're going to get the exception up here, not down here where you actually set the inner HTML. Now the exception message is fairly loud and obvious. It explicitly says you've tried to attach an element which has content which is potentially unsafe. So just be on the lookout for that if you hit it. All right, and if my next demo doesn't run, then I'm in trouble. Okay, so our next topic, local versus web context. All right, yes, we're using web technologies, but the goal here is to write Windows applications. What's the point of writing Windows applications if you can't access the Windows system? That's the whole point of the WinRT. So we want to get to the WinRT, we want to be able to get sensors on the machine, we want to get access to the file system, we want to access the webcam, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Not something that is usually permitted by the sandbox on the web browser. We also want to be able to pull stuff from the web. In fact, some applications, you might go out to Bing Maps and pull down a map. In order to do that, you're going to have to execute code that comes from Bing Maps. Or external analytics scripts. That other gentleman mentioned, external script loaders, that sort of thing. Advertising, we don't want to admit it, but let's be honest, they pay our bills. So those advertisers are going to have a bunch of some script up on their site that we're going to have to pull down and execute. We don't want to package it into our app directly because they may change it. But yeah, web content is untrusted and could be doing bad things. I remember, actually, not too long ago, one of the websites I spent a lot of time on, they get their advertising from Google. And they started sending malware. Somebody had slipped an evil ad into Google's ad serving service. So we need to protect ourselves from this, and we certainly don't want those evil ads to get access to our file system, our webcam, et cetera, et cetera. But we need to be able to do both of these things. So the solution is the idea of contexts. Inside the app container boundary, your code is running in one of two contexts. The first one is the local context. This is what you start up in by default. Okay? The local context has access to WinRT. It has access to the system. It does not have access to the web. You cannot put up an iframe in the local context, say, go pull from HTTP, blah, 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 blah. It will fail. You also cannot put a script tag in your default HTML that points to HTTP colon, blah, 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 blah. It will fail. Right? It is simply flat out blocked. In the local context, essentially, you can only access code and script that is in your AppX package. Conversely, the other context you have is the web context. The rules here are pretty much exactly the opposite of the local context. You have full access to the web. You can pull from arbitrary HTTP, blah, 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 whatevers. You can pull script. You can execute it. You cannot make any calls into WinRT. In fact, if you're executing in the web context, then the Windows.root namespace of the WinRT is simply undefined. It's just not there. You can't get it. So you can choose which context your app operating in. The most common approach to using this is, consider an app that's bringing up, I'll use Bing Maps as an example, and you want to have a little data on your side. Maybe you've got your local appointment book, and you go out to Bing Maps and tell it, okay, tell me where this is, and it will go out and put push pins in the map. Fairly straightforward app. So the idea is you would have your main application will be running in the local context to get access to your calendar, et cetera. You'll have an iframe inside your HTML. Okay? That iframe will be going to an HTTP or HTTPS URL. That URL that you set it is telling this iframe, please go to the web context. And it will switch modes, and the script that's running inside that iframe will not have any access to the WinRT. Okay. Now, there's HTTP or HTTPS, MS-dub-dub-A. You can navigate an iframe to MS-dub-dub-A : whack whack, What that URL scheme does is says, go to my local package. So this is getting content that I've got inside my AppX package. And please run it in a local context. So that script will have access to the WinRT, won't have real access to the web. You could also navigate to local context using local content using ms-web. That's local content inside your AppX package, but it's running in the web context. There's also a trick. You could, in fact, navigate your top-level browser, window.location equals, and you could navigate it to ms-web itself. If you're doing a lot of mashup style work and you don't need a whole lot of access to the WinRT, that might make sense to do. So let's see if this runs. Okay, let's close this. So did I change that? Yes, I did. Okay. Visual Studio. So what I'm actually going to try and run here, if it'll let me. Okay. I'm going to make an attempt here, and I apologize, Mr. AV person, because I think I know what the problem is. And if this screws up the projector, I apologize. That really screwed up the projector, didn't it? Let me just see if my theory is correct. Yes, my theory was correct. Can you guys read that at least? So if you see that error, cannot activate tailored application. Remember, tailored apps, tailored. We've had like 4 different words over the last couple of years on what we're calling these things. Apparently, the error message has not been updated in the current build to Metro style in HTML. Anyway, there's a minimum screen resolution that you need to have in order to show, in order to run one of these Metro style apps. This projector was running below that resolution, and that's why it was running before, because I started the app before I switched resolutions. So, important tip. So this is actually one of our SDK samples. It's called the mashup sample, which is not a great name, but this demonstrates the whole idea of using iframes and navigating to various sites on the web and contexts. Now the fun bit is actually this one, web context versus local context here. Okay. So here we have 2 iframes. The one on the left, and I'm sure the guys over on there can see where I'm pointing. The one on the left here, notice the URL it navigated to. There we go. ms-web. The one on the right, ms-web-web. Remember, this is local context, web context. Okay. Show package info, this is calling into the WinRT. Okay, and it goes out, and it got information about the AppX package that's running. Running in the web context, boom, error. Excuse me. Now if we look at the code here, so default.html, let me get some of this stuff out of the way here. There we go. Come on, go. There we go. The HTML, basically we just have 2 iframes. This is going into this call WinRT HTML file. It's got a button, basically. So, okay, so that's fairly straightforward. This sample, by the way, also does the MSWB exec, so if you're looking for a exec unsafe. So if you're looking for a sample code for what I showed about host enforcement. This is the error you will see. Let me zoom in on that. Unable to add dynamic content to script attempted to inject dynamic content or elements previously modified dynamically that might be unsafe. So if you see that error, that is going to tell you that host enforcement has kicked in. Okay, so back to contexts. so yeah, there was that. Oh, here's an example of pulling down a big map. I'm not going to go out and apply for the app ID right now. That's required from the Bing Map API. But in order for this to work, this piece where it's at the UI, where it's asking for the app ID, and it's actually going to save it to the disk, that needs to be running in a local context. The iframe is running in the web context. So we need to pass information back and forth, right? In fact, it's going to be fairly common if you're doing these mashup style apps. You're going to have some of your app in the local context, some of your app in the web context. Now, the way you do this is with a fairly new API called post message. And so let me, okay, here's an example. Okay, the post message is a method on the window object, or a type window. So iframes implement it. The top level application object, top level window object implements it. Okay, it's fairly simple. The first parameter you pass is an object, which is a string. It's the message you want to send. So you will actually have to do some marshalling. You can't just pass a straight object across this boundary, because if you did that, then nothing would stop you from passing a WinRT object and then completely destroying the security system. The second parameter is the destination domain that the message is supposed to be sent to. This feature was originally designed, I think it actually came out of Mozilla originally. It was designed to allow secure messaging across iframes in general. So it's fairly new, but we've implemented it. Firefox implements it. And I believe it's going through the standards process right now. On the receiver side, this was scenario 4. Let me go back to scenario 4 iframe. Is it here? Okay. On your top level window, you call add event listener for message. That message, then that event handler will get called, and the event object will give you an origin and a data. So you can check, this is recommended, you check the origin of that message to make sure it's coming from somebody you are expecting. So it's fairly straightforward. It is kind of low level. You will have to work out some messaging protocol, and if you want to send messages bidirectionally, this is fine for example, plotting pinpoints on a map, because you just need to tell the map, go put a point here, put a point here, put a point here. If you want the mashup to send data back to the local compartment, you'll have to do it in reverse. The iframe will have to post to the main compartment, and the main compartment will have to sign up for that message event. So this is a fairly complex feature. I would strongly recommend you go look at the mashup sample, this code that I'm looking at here. Walk through it. It will help make things a lot clearer. Alrighty, so I am going to cut my resolution back down here. Yes. Oh, hey, see, it still runs. All right, so let's wrap this up. What have we seen? Common JavaScript patterns. Okay. JavaScript is a language that actually has fairly few features when you look at it compared to something like C++, for example. JavaScript book, spec this long, C++ spec that long. But they are very powerful features that can be combined in powerful ways. The upshot of that is that JavaScript development depends a lot more on patterns and coding conventions. And we have some helpers in the WinJS library to help to make it easier to implement the more common and, in my opinion, necessary coding conventions and patterns, like namespaces and prototypes. If you're a JavaScript application developer, you're using JavaScript libraries, please continue to use them. We fully expect people will do this. It should all just work, with some exceptions about what we just talked about: host enforcement, domain checks, and local web compartments. Oh. So one thing I forgot to mention, and this is also why I was talking about local and web context. That's a typo on the slide. When talking about external libraries, it is very common to, for example, pull jQuery from a CDN. CDN is a reference to an external HTTP URL, right? So can you do that in the local context? No. So remember that when you're building your Apex package, you will need to include the source for whatever libraries you're using in your Apex package. Okay. It's not that big a deal. You just grab it, save it locally, add it to your project. It all just works. But don't expect that CDN reference to work. So recap. Requires patterns. We have helpers. Metro-style apps are just JavaScript and HTML. They just work. Be aware of your security boundaries. Okay, so for those of you who aren't JavaScript experts or familiar with the patterns we talked about today, there's 2 books from O'Reilly that I really, really like. The first one is called JavaScript: The Good Parts. I don't know what it says that book is very, very short. There's also a second book called JavaScript Patterns. I would start with the good parts and then read the patterns book. The patterns book, I think, is more generally useful. It's also a bit more advanced. For reference on your favorite on external JavaScript libraries, go to yourfavoritelibrary.com. And finally, this is a link to the mashup sample. Go to the dev.windows.com, look at samples, search for mashup. It'll pop up first thing. Here's the link for those of you looking at the slides later. And it's got great descriptions and examples of how to use the host enforcement in web and local contexts. All right. So thank you for coming. Please play with this stuff.